Welcome to Right on the Mark with your host, Mark Young. Today we're going to be talking about growing up fishing. Actually, you could say it's a Fishcast podcast. Yeah, growing up fishing with my grandparents was something else. They had this camper down in Smokehole, West Virginia. Actually, it was in Big Bend Campgrounds, probably about 3.5 to 4 hours away. South of Pittsburgh, so you're pretty deep in West Virginia that you go. You go past Seneca Rock. You go past a lot of other sites that you normally wouldn't see in Pennsylvania. I mean, you went past Eagle Rock. You went past a place like a water spring where you got water that came out of a mountain. You saw a lot of old Civil War monuments. You saw Indian fences. You saw a lot of stuff on the trip down there. What I would usually do is go down on the weekend with my grandparents, Bubby and John, and would end up fishing Friday, Saturday, Sunday. The favorite part of going down there was just hanging out in the camper and in the trailer park, believe it or not. I mean, there was a lot of I'd say there was probably about 30 trailers lined up, and you could tell everyone came over the weekend. And if it was a holiday weekend, you even stayed an extra day. And I could remember even missing school a few years just to spend an extra day or two down in Smokehole. Yeah, John just really loved that area, and I grown to like it as well. I mean, a lot of good times back then. I probably started back whenever I was 8 or 9 fishing in Smokehole, mid-'70s. It was every weekend, I swear. I mean, I think I would look forward to it every weekend to go down there. I mean, I was in school at the time. This is year round as well. So like, even in the winter, we would go down to Smokehole. So we did all 4 seasons down there. And, my family came too. My mom and dad came, my brother and sisters came. The trailer really didn't hold that many people. I want to say maybe 4 or 5 max. So we all couldn't go down at one time unless we got a motel nearby. But, my grandparents would take 1 or 2 of us each time. So it'd take myself or my sister, brother. My mom and dad was down there as well. It seemed like a really far place to drive to. Back then, I guess it was 3.5 to 4 hours. I mean, heck, I felt like I was riding in the car all day. I mean, it was probably 150 miles or so. Nowadays, that's nothing to me because I drive a ton. But they would have, the Smokehole area would have a lot of events down there as well. I mean, they had like 4th of July, they'd have fireworks down there. A lot of people came from out of town, and all the trailer the trailer park was actually just all filled up with campers. They did have a general store there. I can remember going down there with Bubby, and she's like, "Go ahead, Mark, pick out whatever you want. It's on me." And boy, I loved going to that store. You get to pick out. It was an old, broken down store. I mean, you were in the middle of nowhere. It was in the middle of the wilderness. All you had was mountains, trees, your camper, and a river. We were near Seneca Rock, which had a lot of eagles at the time. So I believe there was some bald eagles there too. A lot of rock climbing went on there. I know there was some whitewater rafting going on there, a lot of canoeing, even some kayaking back then. But I always liked watching the rock climbers. So I would fish and watch the rock climbers. And I remember this one time a couple of rock climbers got stuck right in the middle of climbing. And they had to throw another rope down, and his hands were burning so bad that he had to leave go of one rope and grab this other rubber rope. So he was on I guess just this burn rope that was killing his hands because he didn't have any gloves, and he's screaming. And somebody else is running up the hillside trying to throw another rope to save him. And they did. They saved him, and he came down safely to the bottom. I don't know, maybe he was up in the air. 150 feet. But yeah, a lot of rock climbing back then, and nothing was patrolled. I mean, you'd very rarely see a policeman down there or a cop. Very rarely did they have the game commission. Only maybe if they were called out on a suspicion or something. If somebody's fishing without a license, or if somebody is taking too many fishes home or something like that. But, Smoke Hole was loaded with golden trout, rainbow trout. I don't know if there was any steelheads. I don't believe there was any steelhead trouts, but there was a lot of other, bluegills in there, bass in there, suckers in there, crappies in there. So there's a lot of other fish, but you went there for the trout. For sure, you definitely went there for the trout. And I can remember my grandfather, John, he always caught fish. I don't know how he did it. I thought it was his rod, and he bought me a different rod. Then I thought it was the vest. He bought me a different vest. Then I thought it was my boots. He bought me different boots. He bought me new boots every couple of years because I kept growing out of them. He wanted to keep it up. He wanted me to keep going fishing with him. He didn't want me to give up. And if I had a rough weekend where I couldn't catch a fish, he'd stand next to me and he would catch it and hand me the rod to reel it in. That was always fun. Just to feel that trout on the other end. And it trying to fight you as you're reeling it in. He definitely was a pro fisherman, I'd like to say. And, he had a lot of friends down there. Just going down there every weekend, you would meet people that they became regulars. I was a regular. My grandparents were a regular. We saw people down there. I remember Jack used to be one of our camper neighbors. And he had a real small camper, and I only saw him a few times a year. And it was really weird because I was young, probably not even 10 years old, and I remember him only having one leg. So I'm not sure what happened. Maybe he got shot off in a war or something, but he only had one leg. And I remember looking out of the camper bedroom window and just staring at him going, wow. And he's just hobbling along. So that was just some of the sights that we would see. But there was other people down there. I mean, there was Bud and Marianne, friends of Bubby and John's. There was Rich, and I'm not sure of his wife's name, and they had a daughter as well. And I always remember that the daughter would always go with them fishing, and I would always go with Bubby and John fishing. And they always try to get together, and I swear they wanted to fix me up with her. I don't even know what her name was, but they always wanted me to play. So we'd play cards together. We'd take walks together. We'd go down to the store together. So, we were just trying to be friends because we knew that we were going to see each other next weekend. So it was always something to look forward to throughout the week, because if you're during school year, you really just had the weekends to look forward to. I went to Catholic school back in the day, and there wasn't really many after school activities. I wasn't, there was no sports or anything going on at that time of the year. So I thought, going camping every weekend was really cool. I mean, they had a really nice spot. I remember helping my grandfather prepare the cabin whenever we got there. The camper was needed flushed. The water needed turned on. The heat needed turned on. You couldn't have a heater, no electric heaters, but Bubby always had an electric heater and burn it a couple times during the night just to keep the camper warm. But they wanted you to have just ventilated heat. I'm guessing it's probably propane. They probably just wanted you to use propane tank, probably because the electric cost too much. And it could be a potential fire, is my guess as well. So I'd help my grandfather, light the pilot light, turn the electric on, put the lights on, stock the refrigerator. We didn't get any TV, although he did have a TV, but you didn't get any cable down there, and the rabbit ears didn't reach anywhere. So you could vaguely see something on the TV, but you really couldn't watch it. So I'm not even sure why he had it there. So basically, you just had some music. He had some 8-track tapes playing there. He had a lot of country music. Johnny Cash was one of his favorites. Would go outside and hang out and just sit on a porch. He had a small porch outside, and you watch people go up and down the road. Especially on the holidays, you'd see a lot of people going up and down the road. And I remember every once in a while, Bubby making fish. So if we caught a lot of fish over the weekend, she would fry fish, and man, it was so good. There was a little kitchen in the camper too. So the trailer had like a bench seat with a couple seats on the other side from what I could remember. And, me and John would just eat fish and baked potatoes and bread and butter. And man, was that good. I'll tell you, I really enjoyed that. Bubby didn't like making the fish as much in the trailer. just because she said it stunk it up, and you can't get the stink out of the trailer. So she'd always open up the doors and the windows trying to air the camper out. It was some really fond memories back then. I mean, there's so many times we would go down there and we'd look for places to eat or just bring stuff to eat. They used to freeze water, and by the time we got down there, it was liquid, so we'd drink it. A lot of canned, I'd say canned hot dogs, Vienna hot sausage. We had some beans, some baked beans. Let's see, what else did we bring there? We had a refrigerator, so we had some pudding in there. We had cottage cheese, pineapple, things like that. There really wasn't a place to go out and eat, so you were kind of on your own. There was a store maybe, I don't know, 5 miles away in Upper Track, maybe 10 to 15 minutes away. Once in a while we'd go there, but not too often because it took into our fishing time. So we would probably fish 3 times a day. My grandfather would get up at 5 or 6 in the morning and go fishing and come back at 8 or 9, and we'd have breakfast. Bubby would make bacon and eggs or sausage and eggs, and man, it was really good. Toast. That's where I first used to put ketchup on my eggs because John used to do that. So that was funny. John was a character. I mean, he only had 3 fingers on one hand because, I always like to say that he was a machinist, but he was basically a farmer by trade almost because he owned a lot of farmland along with his mother out in Cole Center. But he worked for Gervais back then, and I remember him telling me the story of how he got his hands cut in one of the wood choppers. So he's loading branches into the wood chopper in the back of this pickup truck, and he got his hands a little too close to the blade, so he fired one of the tree limbs in, and he came out, and but he was missing 2 fingers. And not that it's funny, but I'd always tell that story. And, he had to do a lot of things different. He'd have to hold the spoon different. He'd have to write differently. And, growing up, I was 8 or 9, 10 years old, like I said. And seeing all this for the first time was kind of crazy. Like, I remember going to the bathroom out in the woods. They would have outhouses, and wasn't used to that. Manessa and I lived in a house, and we had running water and electricity, and it was a regular house. Going down there was a lot of stops on the way that we'd have to just go into an outhouse. I'm like, where's the bathroom? And John would point me in there. I'm like, there's nothing in there but a little hole. And he's like, yep, welcome to the outhouse. And always going down there, seeing all the wildlife was kind of crazy too. Like, I really didn't see deer or fawns running around, or foxes or groundhogs, or even bears around the area. But I'd go down to West Virginia and I'd see that, and I wouldn't know what in the world it was. I'm like, it looks like a dog with big ears, and it was a deer. So that was kind of funny. I remember. John always ribbed me about that. He's like, oh, yeah, that's a dog with big ears every time we saw a deer. It was crazy. I mean, there was a lot of times we'd go down there during some nasty, nasty weather, rain, snow. I mean, John never wanted to miss a weekend, whether it was due to rain, due to snow, due to fog, due to anything, ice, sleet. He always had a big car. He drove a big Chrysler Newport, or he had a Grand Marquis or something always big with a lot of trunk space. And, those side mountains going down there are really, really narrow. So I can remember going down there and hoping that he never went off the edge. But I could remember being really scared a lot of times going down there because of the wildlife, because of seeing fires on the hillside in the woods, not knowing what's going on. I mean, this is whenever I want to say Charles Manson, the killing spree was going on in the late 60s, 70s, and they would talk about Helter Skelter all the time. And you'd see it on TV, so that was kind of scary going down there at night. But, I got through it. I used to love watching, I still do, like watching thriller movies and all those horror movies. And all that comes to mind whenever you're driving in the dark with no one else around, and it's just you on the road with headlights, and you see fire up in the mountains and people just walking on the side of the road. It's almost reminds you of someone like the Wolfman from Chili Billy Cardilli. Those are some good memories that I remember going down there. There were some bad storms we'd run into. I mean, I remember one time we had to stay over in Maryland because we couldn't make it back, and John was pretty, he was pretty bold driving. He wasn't afraid of many things, and one thing was he wasn't afraid of driving. So he drove for a living for Dravos. I mean, he delivered block and concrete, so he definitely knew how to drive, and he always bought a car that had positive traction. Back then, I don't think they made all-wheel vehicles unless it was a legit Jeep, something like that. But I remember him saying, I got this new car and it has positive traction. So whatever that meant, it always gave us positive traction. But the one time it was just too bad for him to bear. I mean, I remember seeing ice freezing on the tree limbs and the trees being down and us just being stranded on a street, on the road for hours. And then he'd get out of the car to go see what's going on, and he would help get the chainsaw, cut the tree off the road so we could all pass through. I mean, it was just really dangerous. But, I didn't really think of it back then. I just felt really safe with them. I know it probably drove Bubby crazy. Yeah, I can remember there's a lot of times where we would be driving and they had a lot of dips on the road, and John would love to fly over those dips and would fly out of our seat in the car and hit the top of the roof. Our heads would hit the roof and she'd yell at him. We didn't wear seatbelts back then. Heck, it's the 70s. Who's going to wear seatbelts back then when you definitely should have? I mean, if you're going to wear seatbelts, that was the time to wear it, but nobody knew about it. I mean, you're like, yeah, it's there, but it's a nuisance to wear. I mean, it's like, who really needs it? But, the part of the fun of the trip was getting there, like I said. I mean, we stopped at a lot of restaurants there as well. I mean, every time we needed gas, there was always a problem. We're always looking for the cheapest gas. And I can remember gas being 70-some cents. And they'd point it out. They'd be like, look, there's a gas station in Hopwood. It's 79.9. Let's stop there and get gas. Then there was times where we almost ran out of gas. So it's hard. If you don't get gas at the right time, you could definitely run out of gas. So part of the fishing process was just getting down there. And I enjoyed that as much as the fishing part. There was a lot of other stuff that we did as well. I mean, we would go down south of the Fork and we would do some sightseeing. We never went through the caves there. We did some fishing up in the northern forks. I think we mostly fished on the southern forks, but the northern forks would go up and sightsee and just see all the other different vehicles and people fishing and see if we knew anybody, just to spend some time over the weekend. They got really, I guess I'll say, fancy in a way, because I remember that there being signs there. They would have signs saying North Fork, South Fork, but that was a few years down the road. As I grew older, I'd go down there, not as much, but I'd go down a couple times a year. And I remember I'm like, oh, they have signs now where to go. Back then, you just had to know where to go. I mean, John knew everything like the back of his hand. I mean, he delivered block and concrete all over the Tri-County states, Ohio, Maryland, West Virginia, definitely Pennsylvania. But, there were some rickety-rackety bridges we would go over as well, too. And Bubby'd be so afraid, don't go over that bridge. It's going to fall. It's going to collapse. And then John would make a 3-point turn on a side road, which would drive Bubby nuts as well, because, she always wanted to play it safe. And he's like, I'm backing up. That tree will save us if we go over. Me not knowing what's going on, I'm like, yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. I was always on John's side. I was never on the safe side as Bubby. I was always on John's side. Like, yeah, let's do it. And that was always fun. I mean, would always pass a lot of wildlife down there, like I said. And I can remember whenever we were, I think we were staying over in Maryland one night because of the weather, and they had a lot of sheep. And I remember going into this one store, and it wasn't a store. I guess it was a motel. This guy had sheep in the lobby, and there were some sheeps that were, I guess, alive and sheeps that were dead. It was really weird. Then they'd have heaters on. So these sheeps are laying next to the heaters, and I never thought to ask, hey, is that sheep dead or are they sleeping? I mean, I pretty much know a sheep, if it's on all four legs, is alive. But what about the ones laying down? Are they actually dead? They're not talking, they're not moving, and they're sitting by heaters. Is he thawing them out? So it was really creepy. Back then, just like the movies they made, I mean, it's just really creepy guys back then. So you had to watch where you went to go eat and where you went to go stop and use a payphone. I mean, there was hardly any service. I remember we'd have to drive out of town just to make a phone call in case something happened. So that was pretty scary. The general store, I don't even think had any places to call. They just had like food and drink back then. There was a lot of times where we'd go to the church. They didn't have church at that time, but I guess one time, maybe back in the Civil War era, that they used to go to church. So we'd go just sightseeing at the church, which is right next door to the general store. And I remember my older sister Debbie saying, "Oh, she loves that church." So I'm not quite sure if she ever went to church there or not. I don't remember going to church there, but I remember going to look at it. So maybe they had church services during the week and I wasn't there, but it was something to see. It was basically a log cabin is what it was. I mean, if you could picture back in the day, maybe the late 1800s, they had log cabins, maybe as churches back then. So that was kind of odd. But I love seeing that. And I'd bring a lot of that stuff back home. So I'd go back to school and I'd tell all my friends exactly what I saw, what I did, what was going on, how crazy it is down there. And I remember telling my cousin Ricky, and he's like, "Oh, Beef, I gotta go. So I talked my grandparents into taking Ricky down, and it's really hard because if you take somebody down and you don't know, you got to tell them that there's not going to be any conversation with any of your family for 2 to 3 days, because we're going to basically be in a dead zone, is what it's known today, because you're not going to get any reception with a telephone, you barely get landline reception, or with a TV or anything like that. So I remember Ricky came down, we set up a weekend, but dang it rained all weekend. So we couldn't get anything. In fact, we had to leave early because there was this creek behind the camper that we stayed in. This creek was really convenient because it was a small stream of water. You didn't go fishing there. It was just enough to gut your fish and clean it. So I remember gutting the fish and cleaning the fish back there. And, maybe the water was, I don't know, maybe 12, 18 inches deep. And you just went in with your boots and you just cleaned the fish, gutted the fish, whether to take it home or not. But I could remember taking my frozen fish home and just showing it off, especially if it was a big fish. If it was a 20, 22-inch trout, I'm freezing that sucker and I'm bringing it back home and I'm showing people. And I remember it being in the freezer so long, it used to have freezer bite. Oh, yeah. I remember opening up the freezer like in the summer and going, "What the heck is this? It's covered in ice." It's like, "Mark, that's your trout you caught." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, what am I going to do with it?" My mom would just throw it out, I think. If you don't eat that fish the first day and you freeze it, it's just not as good. You have to eat it the first day you catch it when it's fresh, because if you freeze it and then eat it again, it's just not as good. But man, it was some good times. I remember catching all those fish and bringing it back. But Ricky really liked that. He really liked that. I don't know if that's what started him into fishing. He's a lot bigger fisherman than I am now. I mean, he still does it. I barely go out. I mean, it's probably been years since the last time I went fishing, but I know Ricky goes out a lot. In fact, the last time I went fishing might have been with Ricky when we went to Erie Steelhead fishing. But that was quite a few years ago. That was a good time steelhead fishing. But keeping on track with Smoke Hole, it was something else. It was a lot of childhood memories there. And I remember there was a big tree in front of our trailer, and it had walnuts. You had to crack open the little shell to get to the walnut. And John said, "Yeah, it's good. You could eat it." So I can remember eating that as snacks and even bringing it home. I'd bring walnuts home just to show people, like, "Look, here's some walnuts. Let's crack them and eat them." But a lot of people didn't really understand back then. I can remember growing up thinking, "Man, I'd love to have a creek in my backyard as a kid." So I'm like going to dig up my backyard, pour a bunch of water, and just keep a stream running. But after I dumped some water down the hole that I dug, it ran out of water. I'm like, "Well, how am I going to get water in a backyard?" And then I was like, forget it. I had a dirt pile up there. I did some cementing. I did some blocking up on my dirt pile in my backyard growing up. But I couldn't get a stream going. Couldn't get a stream built in my backyard, which was kind of funny because I'm like, oh, I don't need to go that 4 or 5 or 3.5 to 4 hours away. I could just fish in my backyard. All I need is a stream. But how you get water from one end to the other, that's just something when you're not even 10 years old that you don't really even think about. I can remember going back quite a few years later, probably, let's see, if that was the 70s, I remember taking my oldest boy, Sean, with me back in the 2000s. I want to say it was around 2007, and just going back and looking at it. It is so regulated now. It's so populated now. It's actually like a resort type atmosphere. My grandparents, Bubby and John, sold their trailer, so it's not there anymore. But Kimball's campground is still there. All the trailers are still there. We took a walk and we tried to look to see where the trailer was. One of the things I do have as a reference point is we took a lot of film back then. They had those, I think it was 8mm film back then that you could take, and it didn't really have sound, but it had a lot of action. So I could remember watching a lot of the films and just watching, where the trailer was and where we fished and like all the landmarks. And when I went back in 2007 with Sean, I took my video camera with me as well. And I was able to videotape a lot of the trip, like the old bridge. The bridge isn't even there. The bridge is there, but they built another bridge around it. And then the highway is paved. It's no longer rocky. And as a matter of fact, I passed up the campground where we stayed because it just didn't look like it. It looked too small. I mean, I remember this campground as being big, but hey, everything is big when you're 8 or 9 years old. But when you go back as an adult, it's not so big. So I'm like, wow, this is it. I'm like, Sean, here's the church. Here's the general store. Quick story on the general stores. I stopped in there in 2007 and there was an old guy there. He must have been, I don't know, close to 80. And I'm like, I got to talk to him. I got to talk to him to see if he remembers myself and my grandparents coming down there, or any of the people. So I'm throwing names at him. I'm like, Jack. I'm like, John, Mary, Bud, and Mary Ann. He didn't know anyone, but then when I said Rich, he kind of knew Rich. I don't remember what his last name was, but he's like, oh, yeah, Rich is still around, because he was always younger than my grandfather, John. He says, yeah, Rich is he's living up in Harrisburg now, and he comes down every once in a while. I'm like, oh, wow, that was so cool. So I ended up talking to him for probably 15 to 20 minutes about what it was like back in the 70s at Smoke Hole. I mean, it was something else. Such a big change from now. I mean, there's signs posted, no fishing. Now they patrol it. Now there's a stock limit. There's a catch limit. There always was, but you were on the honor system. Now they have people that patrol, and you can't drop your line in with a lure. You have to use bait. And my grandfather always was a firm believer in corn. Always use corn. Don't use anything else. I could always remember reading magazines saying, hey, buy this and you'll catch a lot of fish. So I remember buying this can of spray to spray my bait, and I didn't catch a dang thing on that. And it was guaranteed. And I remember John telling me, Mark, anything that's guaranteed doesn't work. So I would spray that bait, my corn or my salmon eggs, and throw it in there, and a fish wouldn't bite it. I even used, one time I caught a golden trout down there, I do remember, and I caught it on Velveeta cheese. So would buy a block of Velveeta cheese and would make little cheese balls. And I think that might have been my first time catching a golden trout on a cheese, and I was shocked that I caught it. I'm like, what is this? I'm like, oh my gosh, my first golden. That is just too funny. I mean, then after that, I never caught a golden trout after that. But man, we would go miles and miles and just walk up and down the stream and go fishing. And, I can remember there's so many incidents I could remember, like the wind blowing and Bubby losing her chair, just going in the water. I could remember just going into the water and, the water being freezing cold and me standing in there and Bubby always watching me saying, don't fall in, because if your boots fill up with water, you're never going to be able to get out of the river. You're going to drown. And I always heard stories of people drowning down there. I've always heard people falling into the water. And, back then, I don't even think I could swim, or maybe I could swim. I might have been just taking swimming lessons. So I'm like, good. I'm like, goodness, if I go in the water, how am I going to get out? So I was always very careful by not going in too far. That was the reason Bubby watched me on her chair. But yeah, going back there that many years later and talking to that guy just brought back a lot of memories. Not even sure what his name was, but he did remember the stuff I remembered, and the store kind of looked the same. It really looked the same. So I did take pictures and videotape of the store, and I was able to bring it back. But the funny thing is you'll see a lot of modern cars there. Like I saw a Mercedes, I saw a Lexus there. But back in the day, you just saw broken down pickup trucks, GMCs or international trucks and just tractors around. But now it's not upscale, but I think they're trying to make it upscale, more of a resort style. So that's the way they left it now, which really, you got to change with the times, I guess you have to say. Well, that about wraps it up with Right on the Mark with your host, Mark Young. Remember to like, subscribe, and tap the bell. See you next time.